he speaks himself to your heart and all that. But God can speak audibly enough. But if your mind is in a wrong direction altogether, no matter how much God can speak, you won't be able to discern his voice. You may not even be able to hear his voice. Let me just give an illustration of what happened in the book of Numbers, chapter 22, verse 28. The other time, there was this evangelist, and a Seventh-day Adventist, very zealous man, and he's a preacher and Adventist among Seventh-day Adventists, and people really respect him. And we were discussing the issue of the original sin, and we were trying to talk about the serpent. So in explaining that, I told him to say, well, you see, the serpent was not really a snake crawling on the ground. It wasn't like that before God cursed it. And even this simple basic truth, denominational preachers can't still grasp even simple things like that. I believe you've seen how Jehovah's Witnesses put up the art in their magazines, and usually, they'll put a snake around some tree speaking to Eve. But then you wonder, how can a snake, with all the anatomy of its mouth, really, how can it how can it utter words? It doesn't have vocal cords. How really did it communicate with Eve if it was a snake? So this Seventh-day Adventist evangelist said to me that, well, Satan possessed it, and, well, it was able to speak. Because, all things are possible in this supernatural world. And so when Satan possessed it, it was able to speak. And then he got excited. He felt like maybe some revelation struck him. He says, remember Balaam? Balaam, the donkey, spoke. So he felt like he found something so great to squeeze me in a corner. But you see, let's just read that portion. Numbers chapter 22, verse 28. And the Lord opened the mouth of the ass, and she said unto Balaam, What have I done unto thee, that thou hast smitten me these 3 times? Now, one man will go out of this scripture and say, well, you see, just as the donkey spoke, so the serpent in the garden spoke. And one time I was in prayer in the living room. That was sometime around 14 hours or so in the afternoon. I was just having a good time speaking to the Lord and just having a time to worship. And then later on, I decided to relax. I was seated on the sofa. And just close by is a door. And then there was a dog which was sitting there, and it was wagging its tail across the door. So it was just a quiet moment. And I was relaxing there, and the dog was just seated there. And but then in a few minutes, something strange happened where I felt like I was getting away from myself. And the dog was actually groaning. You know how a doggy groans? Ooh, something like that. Okay, and as it was groaning, but when this sort of a thing came where I couldn't feel myself in the normal way, I started hearing the voice of what this dog was speaking. It was quite a very odd experience. Like the dog was speaking, like talking. So then in a short while, I got back to myself, and then it was still a normal cry of a dog. But just a few seconds away, when I entered this sort of a trance, I could hear what it was speaking. So Brother John McLauzi was recently in my country. We were having meetings with him. So after he preached in a certain evening service, as I was driving him home, we were chatting and talking about the things of the Lord. So in the course of speaking, he gave a certain testimony where he says, one time I was praying. He was praying for a certain sick person. I think some problem had occurred. So Brother John Mack, as he was praying, then after a short while, a bird came where he was praying, and it stood on the window side. and it cried out with a sound 3 times. And so Brother John Mark says, as it cried out in that sound, I actually heard it say, your prayer has been answered, your prayer has been answered. It did it 3 times. So that excited me, you know. I said, well, how did the bird speak? So he says, well, actually it was just a normal cry of a bird, but I somehow like went into this spiritual dimension where I sort of like heard what the bird was speaking. So that excited me because I had a similar experience some years back, you know. And one day as I was preaching on the original sin, as I went into talking about how the serpent was and all that, then my eyes were opened, and I said, granted, if you were with Balaam on that day when he was moving with his donkey and the donkey cried, granted, if you were with Balaam, you would have only heard the donkey crying. Yes. You would have only heard the donkey crying. You see, you wouldn't have heard it speaking like you and I talk. You see, because it doesn't have vocal cords to speak like that. But Balaam went into this dimension where out of the speaking of the donkey, he was able to catch the words that the donkey was speaking. So you see, when you read the Bible like this, and you don't really have spiritual enlightenment, you can really mix up a lot of things in the scripture, because hearing just with your natural ears is not enough. And that is why in the book of Revelation, we've been admonished on several places which says, he that hath ears, let him hear what the Spirit is speaking. Right. And if it is the Spirit speaking, obviously, it's not the natural ears hearing. It has to be spiritual ears hearing, you see. And God speaks in so many ways. It's not just an audible voice that God can speak in. You see, God speaks in so many situations. The other day I downloaded a sermon which Brother Veremo, I think he must have preached, he preached from here, and he was talking about, I think he was preaching